Our final speaker is Neil and Frau-Cortes. He'll be speaking about towards a reconstruction of Catalan Nuscha'ot. I had to ask him if I pronounced it correctly, and I hope I did. And at any rate, here he is.
Good morning. Yes, you were excellent. Good part of my intervention today, I will be reading, because I usually tend to rant and tell you stories with my guitar, but there's no guitar and not many stories. Can I get an idea how many of you have heard the word nusach? Nusach, yes. Oh, you're so illustrated, that's awesome. How about minhag? Minhag, same, okay. So I don't need really to explain much, but briefly, minhag are anything that is not halacha that we do as a use, like, I don't know, we live the Torah before the reading. And then nusach is the whole corpus of traditions that we do, either liturgical traditions, either textual traditions, how do we do the prayers, what wording we put on the prayers, or musical traditions, what melodies we put into the prayers. And Nuscha'ot is the plural of the word Nusach, which is obviously... Okay, so let me talk a little bit before we go into the subject about music and identity creation, and why is it relevant for this Congress today. The role of music as a catalyzer of collective and individual identity is beyond any doubt. Historic researchers have analyzed numerous cases of national identity recuperation in which music acted as an anchor, a secure link to the past when almost other remnants of the culture have disappeared. In the case of the recuperation of Irish national identity, for instance, music provided a thread of continuity well after the very national language ceased to be a tool of cultural transmission between generations. In some other instances, such as the construction of Pan-Yoruba identity in Africa, what is historically authentic, quote-unquote, is not necessarily cohesive and widely shared, and thus the process of identity recuperation becomes less of a historical reconstruction and more an exercise in social engineering towards the creation of a new tradition. As we know, cultural identity is always relational and contextual, defined by historical cultural patrimony, but self-actualized through social evolution. Mordechai Kaplan conceived Judaism as the evolving civilization of the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, if we consider modern Jewish identity, with the noteworthy exception of rather isolated communities such as some Hasidic sects and etc., we conclude that all Jewish identity is actually a reconstructed identity. Even in the case of groups that are purportedly more attached to tradition, there has been a cultural fragmentation and a break on the historical chain of transmission of this tradition. As a response, human collectives rebuilt their mythical past based on fragments and preconceptions of how the old world was, a dynamic force ever present in migratory communities. For instance, I'll give you an example you will understand really quick. For American Jews, once lost their connection to what is traditional practice, Judaism becomes rather an abstract idea, rather monolithical, fragmentary, and without lots of nuance, more linked to Fiddler on the Roof than to historic reality in pre-war Europe. But how about Nusach and liturgical music? In spite of the common perception that regular Ashkenazi Nusach America, the one that we use in most synagogues, is in fact it is actually ancient in nature. In fact, is it the product of reconstruction. The very seminaries that educated American rabbis since the 19th century did not create cantorial schools until very late. We have 1948 for the School of Sacred Music at AGC, 1952 for the Cantors Institute at JTS, the Conservative, and the last one, the Orthodox, in 1954, the Cantorial Training Institute at Yeshiva University. So, relatively recent. Other than being a reconstruction, American Ashkenazi Nusach is an amalgam of diachronically diverse materials with older layers, such as the tropes of the reading of the Torah, the prayer modes, the so-called Missinai melodies, mostly medieval from Renaissance is little after than that, very numerous 19th century compositions like Lewandowski's Shema, Yisrael, etc., and contemporary pieces like Karlbach, David Friedman's Min Kamocha, or Nurit Hirsch's Ose Shalom Imromav. There is, of course, an overwhelming number of contrafacta, that is, melodies borrowed from secular songs of all the countries of our dispersion. Nevertheless, what happens when the historical chiasm has been so long that there are only very few of these cultural fragments that have survived through the centuries? Then, identity recuperation becomes more of a kind of an illustrated, well-informed, and intentional construction, hence the reconstruction of my title. For this construction to be successful, it has to be deeply rooted in the knowledge of historical heritage. This was the case of the rebirth of Hebrew in Israel, or the reformulation of the holidays, like when the Jews get to Israel and they decide that Shavuot has to re-emphasize the agricultural aspect, for instance, or Hanukkah has to re-emphasize the military aspect. It's a recreation. Once accepted the need of a conscious reconstruction of contemporary Jewish identity, we face the definition of what we consider to be quote-unquote authentic and traditional in the widest sense of the word. In my opinion, in Judaism, authenticity or even sacrality of this tradition is not so much a matter of historical accuracy, but of collective agreement in what a community determines to be authentic. Otherwise, we will incur in attitudes such as saying Sulzer or Karlbach are not traditional, whatever that means. So what is the reason for this long preamble and maybe a little dry? And why is Nusach reconstruction a pertinent subject in this Congress? Particularly when we talk about crypto-Jewish communities. Because in the process of returning, when Jews return, of finding a more open Jewish identity, a more normative one, if you allow me the term, returned conversos go through a reconstruction of the Jewish identity. Quite often, they land in an existing Jewish community that is culturally very different from them. Most of you must have experienced a thing like this. This community often rejects the alterity of the returned Jew, but fortunately, in other cases, a critical number of converts transform the mainstream Jewish community. If the conversos arrive to a community, they are very different, but there are so many that somehow they manage to transform the community of reception. Last year in Santa Fe, and some of you were there, I had the privilege to lead a couple of services in the New Mexican return, for the New Mexican returned Sephardim, and I did it using an almost totally reconstructed Nusach based on a combination of traditional Sephardic elements and contrafacta of traditional New Mexican melodies, particularly alabados melodies. The project came to me as a request. And due to the fact that the returned conversos could hardly recognize themselves in the Ashkenazi liturgical music of the local community, their proposal was very eloquent. They wondered how did the prayers of their ancestors sound like when they came to the Americas. In a case like that, like New Mexico, and lacking much historical documentation, the proposed Nusach was one of the cases of informed reconstruction that I mentioned before. But how about Catalan Nuscha'ot? That's a whole different ball of wax. In the last few decades, the Catalan Jewish community has undergone a deep transformation from a nucleus of first-generation immigrants to a well-rooted and thriving group in fluid osmosis with the country's culture, proud of its past and very comfortable in its modernity. The role of returned conversos has been an important factor in this transformation. You have to think that between 1391 to 1995, there were no official conversions in Spain. That's 600 years roughly, plus the 600. In spite of the well-known presence of groups of cryptos such as the Shuetas, right? Which big group. Then, since the 1990s on, there has been a steady flow of returns and conversions that have brought much needed new blood to the Jewish community. Now, and given the social-political context that is moving towards self-definition and the return to the roots, it is not surprising that the Catalan Jews are embracing a rediscovery of a truly autochthonous Jewish identity. During the past year, I have been collaborating with some Catalan Jewish community leaders in order to tackle a reconstruction of both the Catalan minhag, that is the non-halachic uses, and the Nuscha'ot, that is both the textual and musical liturgical heritage. And we did so in the conviction that this recuperation could be a factor of dynamization or revitalization of the community. Now, you may ask, is it indeed possible to reconstruct a Catalan Nuscha'ot? After all, what do we really know about it? The limits of this presentation will not allow me to go into many details, and probably it will be rather boring to know all those details if you're not super into the subject. But, however, it is possible to learn a number of items related to the medieval Catalan Nuscha'ot and minhag, thanks to the responsa of Shimon ben Semach Duan and Shlomo ibn Adret, and also some of the text of Yehuda ben Barzilai Barceloni and other authors. From the responsa, part of which were already commented by Isidor Epstein, we learned that there were substantial differences between minhag, between Barcelonians, Gironians, Mallorcans, and Aragonese. Hence my title, Nuscha'ot and not Nuscha'ot. We have details on how was the Amidah recited, distribution of space in the synagogue, where did the children sit, what parts were officiated by the rabbi and which ones by the Shliach Tzibur, what was the selection of piyutim, or traditions such as the crowning of children on Simchat Torah, using the Torah scroll crowns. They will march around and put them on the head of the children. Duran also tells us that one is supposed to drink only new wine on the second day of Rosh Hashanah for the Kiddush. And we know that, like most Sephardim, medieval Catalans pronounced most prayers aloud, except for the communities in Tarragona that did not. Some of the issues are very detailed. We know, for instance, that the Mallorcan Jews omitted Psalm 92 when Kippur fell on Shabbat. The Barcelonian says that no way, etc. We hear about restrictions of impoverished Jews, like the rabbis allowing people to read the Torah from a book because they didn't have money to buy a Sefer Torah and none could be found. Or the rabbis criticizing the fact that the youngsters would leave the synagogue during the Haftarah and never bother to return for the Musaf. And they would get really mad about that. We have vivid details of ritual on the Shabbat preceding a wedding, like getting an extra scroll out and the groom reading after the maftir, before the maftir, the episode of Isaac finding Rebecca. And I have only 5 minutes left. We are in trouble. From Yehuda ben Barzilai Barcelona, we have a plethora of ritual details, as We know, for instance, we only know a few fragments of the works of this Catalan Talmudist, with the exception of the few fragments. Mostly, we know whatever we know about Tzeloni from Keter Shem Tov, Gagin Keter Shem Tov. We know from him, for instance, that on the Mincha of Erev Shabbat, Catalans say Kaddish after the silent Amidah and before the repetition of the Amidah, which is a kind of a not so normal Sephardic tradition nowadays. Furthermore, the Catalan Nusach and its variations never disappeared in 1391, and both disappeared into thin air. Until the mid-20th century, there were Majorcan and Catalan Rite synagogues in Thessalonica, in Rome, Algiers, and other cities. At least in Salonika, the community printed some of the prayer books. You got some of them there. In other cases, such in Rome, the difference between Sephardic and Catalan Nusach was annotated in the margin of a number of Sidurim. This is how we Sephardim do it, and Spanish do this other thing, and yet Catalans do this other thing. In any case, Catalan Nusach is not by any means an obscure in the fringes, small local rarity. Back in its day, it was considered to be one of the main traditions. Thus, Yeshaya Horovitz, the author of the Shelah HaKadosh, quotes the Arizal, saying that just as the Jewish nation encamped in 4 groups, Arba de Galim, so too there are 4 main halachic traditions: those of Sefarat, Ashkenaz, Catalonia, and Italy, words of the Arizal. Each tradition should maintain its unique Masorah, for they are all the words of the living God, end quote. Up to this point, we were considering only matters of minhag and textual nusach, but what can we know about the remnants of the music, of the Catalan music that were used in the Catalan nusach? Well, it is well known that we have no musical transcriptions, barely, of the Jewish music in the medieval times, and not to mention none of this particular nusach. We are therefore limited to written description, hints here and there in medieval works on other subjects. Again, in Shimon Tzemach Duan, Magen Avot, we have a major source. It informs us of the existence of 4 Catalan trop systems, describes the Te'amim or the Te'amei Mikra in words like short, descending, like long, and also talks about neutralizations that would allow us to find a Vorlage of a particular cantillation system. He also identifies the origin of the piyutim with the melody that the piyut was sang to. So he will tell us there are all melodies like those of Kalir, some melodies like the ones from France that follow the rhyme and the rhythm, or those from Andalusian poets with their Arabic poetry, feet and melodies that steal your heart. Regarding the music of the Catalan diaspora, for the moment we have discovered very few concrete things. For instance, we have a brief recording of a Catalan vidui in the Leo Levy collection, but we assume that given the historical relationship with the city of Livorno and the escaped conversos, there was a lot of interaction between that local nusach. So the next step in my research are based on a systematic exploration of this textual documentation that will allow the redaction of a more systematic compendium of minhagim, or perhaps even an annotated sidur. Furthermore, we plan to conduct a series of interviews with cantors, Greek and Roman cantors that are still have like vague memories of Catalan nusach. Finally, as in the case of the New Mexican nusach, our project is not limited to academic research, but it has an eminently practical side. It is time for the new Catalan Jews to decide what part of this nusach really talks to them. But we have tried to reconstruct a nusach using both historicist, if not historical, historicist contrafacta on medieval and Renaissance melodies, new contrafacta from traditional materials familiar to the users, and also borrowing Akin melodies from the wider Sephardic world. In conclusion, I think that this is one of the rare occasions where historical research has practical implications, such as the potential of recreation or helping to recreate this Jewish identity. After all, it will be up to our sisters and brothers in the Catalan-speaking countries, many of them returned composers, to find their own voice in the Jewish world. And
Yes, sir.
Neil, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to sing one of those
little briefly, this is a melody called Montañas del Canigó, and you will see that it is inserted into an Adonai Malach mode for the Friday night service. So it will be Rauhanim et gevurato, shivecho vechodolismo, umalchuto, meratzon, kivelu alechem, Moshe uvenei Yisrael, lechanu shira vesimcha raba ve'amru kulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar v'kodesh nora tehilot osefene malchut teharu banecha k'hayan livnei Moshe zelivenu ve'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'ne'emar.